Hi to all. This is Sister Nasia from the Department of English. We shall discuss the poem, The Wind-Up Doll. The theme of the poem is Awakening Female Consciousness and Identity. This poem was written by Forough Farrokhzad. The outcomes of the poem, The Wind-Up Doll, are students will be able to differentiate the psychological frustrations of women in a restrictive time where women were treated like objects and are suppressed. Analyze the social condition of the time, addressing human suffering and inadequacy, inequality. And the final one is they'll be able to evaluate the values learned from the poem and apply them in the real life. We cannot expect a dynamic and active role for women in a patriarchal society. In such a society, women suffer from the lack of an independent identity and all their ideals and desires to fulfill men's demands. Forough Farrokhzad ridicules and criticizes the cultural position and unconsciousness of her contemporary women by a rich and deep awareness arising from her poetry as an iconoclast and rebellious poetess and a dominant female voice. Her poem, The Wind-Up Doll, is a caustic metaphor for women, is a call for female consciousness to claim their own identity. Undoubtedly, contemporary Persian literature, without Farrokhzad, the sad lady of Persian poetry, is inadequate and incomplete. She was a poet with a new and modern vision in a traditional and patriarchal society. She made changes in Persian poetry by breaking with tradition, and these changes have been created a style in the Persian feminine poetry. She was known as the most important woman in Iranian history, the greatest poetess in Iran, and one of the great poets of 20th century. Her life and art is considered as one of the women's poetic struggle within a purposefully patriarchal society. Farrokhzad was the first woman in Iranian literature who revolted against the patriarchy through a woman's poetic art. This rebelliousness has been mirrored in both her personal life and her career. Giving scholarly attention, Farrokhzad can be categorized into two thematic patterns, Farrokhzad and rebellion, and Farrokhzad and self-identity. Farrokhzad was aware of her talent and capacity as a woman poet, rebelled against all the restrictions. Her life reveals that women are central in her creative imagination. Her works have been considered to be a true voice of Iranian women against male-dominated society and oppression of women's rights. Farrokhzad indicated this concept and ideal throughout her works. She attempted to demonstrate the lack of respect to women by showing her paltry situations in her society. This role of the speaker as spokesperson is explicit and obvious in The Wind-Up Doll, which vividly outlines the middle class Iranian woman's potentially lifeless status as wife. Of course, the poet is neither there saying that all Iranian women are in such a situation, nor revealing explicitly how Iranian women should live. She does not seem here to be accusing men of forcing women into roles as wind-up dolls. Nevertheless, she presumes to speak for more than herself. Farrokhzad's The Wind-Up Doll indicates a woman's incapacity in her choices due to male domination and patriarchy. The poem depicts women who aren't conscious or even thinking women who are sacrificing their potential as individuals to man and convention. The poem represents a demand that women take responsibility for their own individuality. It examines everyday activities of educated urban Iranian women and cautions them against accepting in the submissive roles for which society destines them. They have to gain voice and not to be silenced for a long. Using verbal irony, she says, more than this, yes, more than this, one can stay silent, to criticize the silenced women in the patriarchal society of the time. In the second stanza, the speaker, as spokesperson, wants these women to reject the role of a prisoner, an mobile and stopped woman, and to call for movement and taking more active equal roles. Moreover, the poem attacks the emptiness of a woman's environment. The first stanza immediately and specifically establishes the pallid aliens and death, far from emphasizing with the woman's solitude or even dwelling on it. The narrator criticizes her apathy, her lack of participation in what she observes from her window as an inanimate doll. With a fixed gaze like that of the dead, one can stare for long hours at the smoke rising from a cigarette, at the shape of a cup, at a faded flower on the rug, at a fading slogan on the wall. Here, the outside world presents a vibrant contrast to the smoky and listless room. Inside, even the flowers and the carpet are faded. Everything in the room, down to the woman's fingers, seems drained of vitality. But she opens the curtain onto a scene of motion, color, and sound, startling after the sluggishness we have just seen. The rain falling hard, the spots of color and the balloons bright against it, and the old cart moving away loudly and quickly, all invite involvement of the senses. The woman remains oblivious, but blind but deaf. She stopped motionless, passive, and marginalized. It portrays the dark and meaningless, like of suppressed woman metaphorically. To accept and follow the traditional male defined role of a woman is to live a doll life, in fact, she says. One can draw back the drapes with wrinkled fingers and watch rain falling heavy in the alley, a child standing in a doorway, holding colorful kites, a rickety cart leaving the deserted square in a noisy rush. In the next two stanzas, the spokeswoman indicates that the woman can be a sexy toy, a homemaker, or a housekeeper subordinated to the dominant arms of the man, but it is not desirable and valuable. It cannot bring inner satisfaction for her, as it is false and quite absurd. Taking the role of a sex toy, a Madonna, and a doll to fulfill a drunk, a madman, or a tramp's hunger will be destructive and will ruin her identity. They illustrate hypocrisy and self degradation in women's relationships with men. It signifies self censorship as a major theme in Farrokhzad's poetry. Metaphorically, the Iranian women are self degraded as they are not aware of their self censorship. They objectify and subordinate themselves. In fact, they accept to be treated like a wind up dolls. These women, she describes, stay behind their curtains, even in their own minds, and limit their intellectual activity to the thoroughly conventional solving of crossword puzzles. One can degrade with guile all the deep mysteries. One can keep on figuring out crossword puzzles, happily discovered the inane answers, inanimate of the 5 or 6 letters. The woman entertains herself with vain entertainments in her room, having no active participation, deep awareness, and serious quest for identity in the male dominated society. Furthermore, equally futile is the thoughtless participation and religion that the next stanza dismisses. An automation can undertake any of the first three actions without engaging mind or heart and can rot in a mosque as a result. The stanza depicts religion as centered on death, whether completed as with the cold shrine and the nameless grave, or in progress, a living decay as with that of the woman. The poem continues with the additional contemptuous descriptions of women's lack of engagement and their consequent fading female identity. With bent head, one can kneel a lifetime before the cold, gilded grill of a tomb. One can find God in a nameless grave. One can trade one's faith for a worthless coin. One can mold in the corner of a mosque like an ancient reciter of pilgrims' prayers. It is worth mentioning that the above stanza can be a reference to Farrokhzad's first letter to Pervez, her divorced husband, at the first night after her divorce, in which she expresses her inability to find something meaningful in her life. The concern with a constant, predictable result emphasizes the lack of intellectual courage and profound lethargy. The inability, unawareness, or unwillingness to break through inertia and begin actively living or even thinking. Here, Farrokhzad clarifies the reluctance of the conventional role. She is serious to achieve her real female identity, operating with zero in addition, subtraction, and multiplication is secure in that the result is constant. One can be constant like a zero, whether adding, subtracting, or multiplying, she says. Here, zero can be considered as a metaphor for absurdity or no self identity for women. Many people think determinedly in terms of nothingness. The result will be death before dying, which the poet describes in the rest of the stanza. Eyes like colorless buttons evoke the fixed stare of a corpse from the first stanza, and the image of a person drying up like water in a container echoes the woman's already dry fingers pulling aside the curtains in an imaginary prison of ignorance. She says one can dry up in one's basin like water. Beautifully signifies the central theme of the poem. To be passive, stopped, and imprisoned is like water drying up in a basin, while water is the alphabet of growth and life. It is an artistic metaphor for doll like women. Furthermore, it signifies a bee having no honey or a woman with no identity. She continues avidly, avoiding any kind of self introspection creates a void. She says, with shame, one can hide the beauty of a moment's togetherness at the bottom of a chest. Moreover, the empty frame signifies the lack of identity, passivity, and emptiness for the woman living a dull life suffering from self degradation and self censorship. Honestly, experiencing the beauty of a moment requires a degree of the same type of courage that taking mystery seriously does. In order to do either, a woman needs to face herself, drawing on her own experiences to interpret what she confronts, whether it be the consideration of an unknown or the deliberate savoring of an instinct. Either action requires a kind of consciousness and awareness that would be impossible for someone living in the willful stupor that the women of the wind up doll live in. Thus, they avoid the experience in embarrassment as they would avoid looking at an unflattering photograph. The elimination of so much from a life certainly leaves an empty space, as we see in the poem's initial stanzas and in the later references to empty frame of a day. Although the wind-up doll isn't apocalyptic, it does not offer even so much hope as this for such women's revival. They cover flaws, cracks in the wall, and their lives with masks so they don't need to know they are there, much less contemplate them. Sleeping for years in a box bears a remarkable similarity to being dead. And examination of the descriptions of eyes alone throughout the poem supports the idea that these women essentially are passive, absurd, and dead. The fixed stare like that of a corpse in the beginning, the eye like a colorless button from an old shoe later, and finally seeing one's world with two glass eyes, all characterize a wind-up doll, a sarcastic metaphor for women ignorant of their real identity and social role. Metaphorically and beautifully, Farrokhzad depicts the wind-up doll, that is, the woman, seeing the world and her future through her glass eyes, that is, fantasy, where she lies in a felt lined box, grave, marriage, family, institution, or the male dominated society, etc., where she has no identity and her life is passive, unreal, subordinated, and absurd. Farrokhzad is fully aware of serious responsibilities the women have to pursue. In fact, the whole poem is a sorrowful lament or a sarcastic description of the attitude of Iranian middle class women of the time and a warning that their unawareness and unconsciousness is very much dangerous for their female identity. She says, at every lustful touch, for no reason at all, one can give out a cry, ha, so happy am I. Using an exclamation mark, she believes that real happiness will be in consciousness of real identity, not in playing a role of a sex toy or living a doll life. Here, Farrokhzad is of opinion that the submission to man is the essential danger for female identity that Farrokhzad is warning against. The types of women that the wind-up doll portrays have given up their souls and their minds to conform to society, and they no longer exist as an individuals, even in the privacy of their thoughts. That is the essential danger she talks about. Coming to conclusion of the poem, Forough Farrokhzad's The Wind-Up Doll ridicules and criticizes the cultural position and unconsciousness of her contemporary woman by a deep awareness arising from her feminist poetry. The wind-up doll, a sarcastic metaphor for subordinate woman, is an awakening call for female consciousness to claim their own identity, addressing those women of the country who live a doll life. The poem represents a demand that women have to take responsibility for their own individuality by rejecting self degradation and self objectification and accepting the self respect and female real identity. She warns them against acquiescing in submissive roles for which patriarchal society destines them. They have to unveil themselves, gain self respect, and achieve identity through self recognition. Thank you.